We got the call at 0200 hours. No pleasantries, no explanations, just orders. The kind of orders that didn't leave room for debate. Special assignment, high priority. That was all they told us. I knew from the moment I stepped into the briefing room that something wasn't right. The air was thick with tension, the kind that didn't come from a standard mission. The officers avoided eye contact, their clipped tones betraying nerves they didn't want to show. The briefing was vague, coordinates to a classified facility in the middle of nowhere. Investigate and secure was the official line, but the unspoken part was clear. We were being sent to clean up something bad. The facility, they told us, had gone dark, no communication for 72 hours. The last transmission was garbled, full of static and strange interference. They played a recording for us, and I'll never forget the sound. It wasn't the static that got to me. It was what was underneath it. A low hum, barely audible, like a heartbeat coming from somewhere deep and far away. We were 6 in total, a small team equipped with standard gear and the usual assurances. "You'll be fine," they said, "just an equipment malfunction or a weather issue. In and out." We all knew better. The transport dropped us a mile from the facility. The tundra stretched out in every direction, endless and white, under a sky that felt too big. The wind howled, cutting through our gear like it wasn't even there, and every step felt heavier than it should have. The facility came into view slowly, emerging from the snow like a wound in the landscape. It was all sharp angles and steel, half buried and surrounded by a wire fence that had long since been twisted out of shape. A gate hung open, swaying gently in the wind, creaking with every gust. We approached cautiously, weapons ready. No movement, no lights, no sound. Just the faint crunch of our boots on the frozen ground. Inside, the place was a mess. Papers scattered across the floor, overturned chairs, monitors smashed like someone, or something, had gone on a rampage. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of something metallic and faintly sweet. We split up to clear the main level, each of us taking a corridor. Mine was lined with doors, each one labeled with numbers and letters that didn't mean anything to me. Most of them were locked, but one was ajar. The room beyond was small, filled with equipment I didn't recognize. Machines with blinking lights, their displays frozen on incomprehensible data. In the center of the room was a chair, its restraints undone but still smeared with something dark and dried. I didn't linger. We regrouped in what we assumed was the control room. It was a wreck. Monitors shattered, wires torn out of the walls, and a desk overturned, its contents spilling onto the floor. "Something happened here," Foster said, his voice low. "Something bad." Nobody disagreed. Then we found the first body. It was slumped in the corner, partially hidden under debris. The uniform marked them as a technician, but their face, it wasn't right. It was twisted, contorted into an expression of pure terror. Their eyes were wide, unseeing, and their hands were clawed, like they'd been trying to fight off something we couldn't see. Foster cursed under his breath. The team leader, always calm, just muttered, "Keep moving." We did. The deeper we went, the stranger it got. The walls were marked with symbols, etched deep into the steel. At first, they seemed random, like scratches left by something sharp, but the more we saw, the more deliberate they looked. "What do you think it means?" someone asked, but nobody answered. The air grew colder, sharper, the kind of cold that didn't just bite your skin, but burrowed into your bones. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just the faint hum growing louder with every step. And then the lights flickered. It wasn't just a power surge, it felt intentional, like something was playing with us. The shadows stretched and danced in the dim light, moving in ways they shouldn't have. That's when Foster froze. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "See what?" the team leader asked, his tone sharp. "There," Foster said, pointing down the corridor. "Something moved." We all turned, weapons raised, but the hallway was empty. Just the same flickering lights and endless stretch of steel walls. "Stay focused," the team leader ordered, but even he sounded uneasy. We kept moving, but the hum was louder now, vibrating through the walls, through us. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. Something alive. Something waiting. When we reached the central chamber, we understood why they sent us. The room was massive, filled with machines that looked far too advanced for anything we'd seen before. In the center was a sphere, suspended in mid-air, glowing faintly. It pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat, and the air around it felt wrong, heavy, charged, almost alive. "What the hell is that?" someone muttered, but no one answered. We weren't alone anymore. It started with the shadows. At first they seemed to flicker along the edges of the room, just out of reach of the dim, pulsing light from the sphere. But then we realized they weren't just flickers. They were moving, deliberate, and slow. "Did you see that?" Foster whispered, his voice barely audible. This time he wasn't imagining things. We all saw it. A shape just barely visible, slipping along the far wall. Not a person, too tall, too thin. Its movements unnatural, like it was sliding rather than walking. "Hold your positions," the team leader ordered, though his voice cracked at the edges. The hum from the sphere grew louder, vibrating through the floor and into our bodies. My teeth rattled, my head throbbed. It wasn't just noise, it was inside us, crawling into our thoughts and twisting them into shapes that didn't feel like our own. We didn't dare approach the sphere, but it felt like it was pulling us closer anyway, like gravity bending the space around it. The markings on the walls, those strange, deliberate symbols, seemed to glow faintly now, pulsing in rhythm with the sphere. Foster started to back away, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "We need to get out of here," he muttered, more to himself than to us. But the team leader wasn't ready to give up yet. "We're not leaving until we know what the hell this is. Stay sharp." As he spoke, one of the monitors in the corner of the room flickered to life. Static filled the screen, but then an image emerged, grainy and distorted. A face, gaunt, pale, eyes wide with terror. A man in a lab coat, staring directly into the camera. "They opened it," the man said, his voice cracking. "We told them not to, but they wouldn't listen. It's not just a portal, it's a door. And doors can swing both ways." The feed cut off abruptly, replaced by more static. "What the hell does that mean?" someone whispered. Nobody answered. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating. The shadows along the walls grew bolder, creeping closer, their movements sharper, more deliberate. Then the lights flickered, and for a split second we saw it. Standing in the far corner of the room, just on the edge of the light. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. "Open fire!" the team leader shouted, his voice breaking the silence. The sound of gunfire shattered the stillness, bullets tearing through the air. But the thing didn't react. The rounds passed through it like it wasn't even there, embedding themselves into the walls behind it. Then it moved, not toward us, but around us, its form blurring, stretching, folding in ways that didn't make sense. The sphere pulsed brighter, the hum rising to a piercing wail that made us all drop to our knees, clutching our heads. I could feel it then, not just the sound, but the presence behind it. Something vast, incomprehensible, pressing against the edges of reality, trying to break through. Foster was the first to crack. He screamed, dropping his weapon and stumbling backward. "It's in my head," he yelled, his voice raw. "I can't!" Before he could finish, the shadows engulfed him. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, swallowed whole by the darkness. We didn't stop to think. We ran. The corridors twisted around us, the markings on the walls glowing brighter, pulsing faster. The hum followed us, relentless, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was all there was. The facility didn't make sense anymore. Hallways looped back on themselves, doors opened to places they shouldn't, and no matter how far we ran, we couldn't find the way out. At one point, we stumbled into a room we hadn't seen before. It was small, claustrophobic, with walls covered in those same glowing symbols. In the center was a table, and on it was a notebook, its pages filled with scribbled notes and diagrams. One word stood out, scrawled over and over again in frantic, jagged letters. "Don't." We didn't wait to find out what it meant. The hum was everywhere now, so loud it drowned out everything else. I couldn't hear the others, couldn't even hear myself think. It was in my head, digging deeper, unraveling me piece by piece, and then I saw it again. Not the thing from before, but something worse. A shape, impossibly large, moving through the walls, like the facility itself was bending around it. It didn't have a form I could describe, not a body, not a face, but something vast and ancient, filling the space with its presence. It wasn't just watching us, it was waiting. We pressed on, though none of us could explain why. Instinct, maybe, or desperation. But the further we went, the more the corridors felt alive. The walls were warm to the touch, almost pulsing under our hands, like they had veins just beneath the surface. The symbols carved into them were brighter now, shifting and twisting in ways that defied logic. Nobody spoke. We didn't need to. The fear in the air was thick enough to choke on, and every one of us knew that stopping meant death. Or worse. The hum had changed again. It wasn't just noise anymore. It had a rhythm now, a pattern that seemed almost intentional, like it was trying to tell us something, or lure us somewhere. Collins was the next to break. He was at the back of the group, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, like he expected something to leap out of the shadows. I can't do this," he muttered, his voice trembling. The team leader barked at him to keep moving, but Collins didn't listen. He stopped in the middle of the hallway, his hands clutching his helmet like he was trying to block out the noise. "It's calling me," he said, his voice hollow. "Don't you hear it?" "Collins," the team leader snapped, stepping toward him. "Pull it together. That's an order." But Collins just shook his head. "It doesn't matter. We're not supposed to be here. None of us are supposed to be here." And then he ran. We shouted after him, but he didn't stop. He sprinted down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. For a moment, we just stood there, frozen, listening to the echo of his footsteps fade into silence. We should have gone after him. But something in the air stopped us, something cold and final that whispered, "Don't." The team leader was the first to break the silence. "We keep moving," nobody argued. The corridors grew narrower, the walls pressing closer until we were practically walking single file. The symbols were everywhere now, glowing so brightly they cast flickering shadows across the floor. And the hum, it was deafening. It wasn't just in the air anymore. It was in us, vibrating through our bones, our skulls, filling every corner of our minds with thoughts that weren't our own. We stumbled into another room, larger this time. It looked like some kind of lab, with tables covered in strange equipment and monitors that flickered with distorted images. The walls were lined with glass tanks, each one filled with a thick, dark liquid. And inside, the tanks were things. I don't even know how to describe them. They weren't human. They weren't even close, twisted, elongated shapes that seemed to writhe and shift under the surface, their forms changing every time you looked at them. One of the tanks cracked as we walked past, a thin line spidering across the glass. The liquid inside oozed out, thick and viscous, pooling on the floor. And then something moved inside. We didn't stick around to see what it was. The team leader urged us forward, his voice sharp and unyielding. But even he was shaking now, his eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. We reached another door, larger than the others. It groaned as we pushed it open, revealing a chamber that was unlike anything we'd seen before. The sphere was there, suspended in the center of the room, its surface glowing with a light that wasn't quite light. It pulsed steadily, casting strange, warped shadows across the floor, and around it were the bodies, dozens of them scattered like discarded puppets. Some wore lab coats, others uniforms like ours, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and agony. But it wasn't the state of their bodies that made my stomach churn. It was their eyes. They weren't blank or lifeless like you'd expect. They were alive, wide and staring, locked onto the sphere. "It's like they're trapped," Foster whispered, his voice barely audible. The team leader ignored him, stepping closer to the sphere. He raised a hand like he was about to touch it, but stopped short, his fingers trembling. "What is it?" someone asked, though the question felt pointless. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't something we were meant to understand. Then the hum stopped. The silence was worse. It was suffocating, pressing down on us like the air had been sucked out of the room. And then, one by one, the bodies began to move. It wasn't natural. Their movements were jerky, mechanical, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. Their heads twisted toward us, their eyes wide and unblinking. "Back up," the team leader ordered, but his voice was drowned out by the sound. It wasn't the hum this time. It was a voice. Not one voice, but many, overlapping and echoing, filling the room with a sound that made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't be here," it said. The lights flickered again, plunging us into darkness. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light. It felt alive, pressing against us, smothering every sound except the faint shuffle of movement. I couldn't see my team, but I could hear their breathing, shallow and quick, as if the air itself had turned to lead. Then the voice came again, not in the room, but inside my head. "You don't belong." It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a weight behind the words that made my stomach churn and my thoughts scatter. I stumbled back, bumping into someone. They didn't react, too frozen by the same oppressive force. The sphere pulsed again, and for a split second it illuminated the room. What we saw in that brief moment made me wish it hadn't. The bodies were no longer scattered across the floor. They were standing now, impossibly upright, their limbs bent at wrong angles, their heads tilted too far back. Their mouths hung open, but no sound came out. And their eyes, God, their eyes, locked onto us like they could see straight through to the things we didn't want to admit even to ourselves. Then the light vanished again, plunging us back into the suffocating black. Foster panicked. "We have to get out of here!" he shouted, his voice cracking. He broke away from the group, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the corridor. "Foster, don't!" the team leader barked. But it was too late. We heard his scream seconds later, cut short by a wet, crunching sound that made my stomach twist. The sound hung in the air, followed by silence. None of us moved. The team leader's voice was barely a whisper. We stick together. No one else runs! The sphere pulsed again, brighter this time, lighting up the room in short, irregular flashes. The bodies were closer now, surrounding us, their twisted forms jerking forward in bursts of motion. "We need to move," someone said, their voice trembling. The team leader hesitated, glancing at the sphere. "This thing, it's the source. We destroy it. We stop whatever this is." "How?" I asked, gripping my weapon tighter. My hands were shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he moved toward the sphere, his steps slow and deliberate, like he was walking against a current. The air seemed to ripple around him, distorting his form as he got closer. The voices returned, louder now, overlapping and echoing in a way that made it impossible to focus. I couldn't understand the words, but they felt sharp, cutting into my thoughts like shards of glass. Then the sphere stopped pulsing. The light was constant now, a blinding, searing glow that painted everything in harsh, unnatural colors. The bodies moved faster, jerking toward us in sharp, erratic bursts. "Cover him!" I shouted, raising my weapon. We opened fire, the deafening bursts of gunfire cutting through the chaos. The bullets tore through the bodies, but it didn't matter. They didn't fall. They just kept coming, their limbs twisting and snapping back into place as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. The team leader reached the sphere, raising a hand toward its surface. For a moment he hesitated, then he touched it. The room erupted in light and sound, a wave of energy that knocked us off our feet. I hit the ground hard, the air punched out of my lungs. When I opened my eyes, the sphere was gone. The bodies were gone too. But the room wasn't empty. Standing in the center, where the sphere had been, was something. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything. Its form shifted constantly, twisting and folding into shapes that made my eyes ache just to look at. And it was staring at us. The hum returned, deeper this time, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my bones. I couldn't move, couldn't think. It felt like the thing was inside my head, unraveling me thread by thread. The team leader collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. He screamed, but it wasn't just a scream, it was a sound of something breaking, something being torn apart from the inside. Then he was gone. Not dead. Not even a body left behind. Just gone. Like he had never existed. The thing turned to us. We didn't wait. We ran, stumbling back through the corridors, the walls, twisting and shifting around us. The markings glowed brighter, their shapes changing into something that felt alive, watching, waiting. No matter how far we ran, the hum followed, growing louder, more insistent. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe, and my vision blurred as the corridors seemed to stretch endlessly. One by one, the others fell behind. I didn't see what happened to them. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how I made it out. One moment, I was running, the hum so loud it drowned out my own thoughts. The next, I was outside, stumbling into the frozen tundra under a sky that didn't look right. The stars were too bright, too close, shifting in patterns that didn't make sense, and on the horizon, I saw it, the thing, standing perfectly still, watching me. It's still watching. I don't know how long I stood there in the snow, staring at that thing on the horizon. It didn't move, but the weight of its presence pressed down on me like it was trying to pull me back. The wind bit into my skin, the cold so sharp it felt like needles, but I couldn't look away. It wasn't just a figure. It was more than that. Bigger than I could see, bigger than I could understand. Even from this distance I could feel it, an overwhelming sense of wrongness, like it wasn't supposed to exist, like I wasn't supposed to exist in its presence. Then the ground shifted beneath me. It wasn't like an earthquake. It was more like the world itself was bending. The snow rippled under my feet. the horizon stretching and twisting like a piece of fabric being pulled in too many directions. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they weren't my own. The pull was stronger now, dragging me toward the thing on the horizon, even though it hadn't moved an inch. The hum was back, louder than ever, vibrating through my chest, my skull, my thoughts. And then I heard them. The others. Voices, familiar but wrong, echoing all around me, overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. "You can't leave," one of them whispered. "Stay," another said, closer this time. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the endless white of the tundra stretching in every direction. Then I saw them. They were scattered across the snow, barely visible at first, like shadows in a storm. But as they moved closer, I realized they weren't shadows. They were my team, or what was left of them. Foster, Collins, the team leader, they were all there, their faces pale, their eyes wide and empty. Their bodies moved stiffly, like puppets being dragged forward by invisible strings. "Help us!" Foster said, his voice flat and emotionless. His mouth didn't even move, but the words were clear, cutting through the wind like a knife. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "You're not real," I whispered, more to myself than to them. Foster tilted his head, his neck bending too far, the motion too smooth to be human. "Neither are you." The hum grew louder, and the snow beneath me started to glow, faint symbols etching themselves into the ice. They pulsed in rhythm with the hum, the pattern spreading outward in perfect, deliberate lines. I turned to run, but the horizon was gone. The tundra stretched endlessly now, no end in sight, no direction that felt safe. The others moved closer, their eyes locked onto me, unblinking. "You can't leave," they said in unison, their voices overlapping, hollow and mechanical. I ran anyway. The snow turned to ice beneath my feet, slick and uneven, and I slipped, landing hard on my side. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs, but I forced myself up, my hands shaking as I pushed forward. The hum wasn't behind me anymore. It was ahead, everywhere, coming from the very air around me. And then I saw it again. The thing on the horizon. Only now it wasn't distant. It was right there, towering over me, its form impossible to comprehend. It shifted constantly, folding in on itself, its edges blurring like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. I fell to my knees, the weight of it pressing down on me like gravity turned inside out. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind felt like it was being ripped apart, my thoughts unraveling into fragments that I couldn't hold on to. The voices returned, louder now, screaming inside my head. "You opened the door!" I tried to scream back, but no sound came out. The thing leaned closer, its form twisting and stretching until it filled my entire vision. I felt its presence in every part of me, tearing through my memories, my fears, my very sense of self. And then, just as quickly as it began, it stopped. The weight lifted, the hum faded, and I was alone. I looked around, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The tundra was gone, replaced by an empty void that stretched endlessly in every direction. The air was thick and warm, humming faintly with a pulse that matched my own heartbeat. And on the edge of the void I saw them. Not my team, not the bodies. Something else. Shapes, vast and incomprehensible, moving through the emptiness like shadows in deep water. They were too far away to see clearly, but I could feel them watching me, their attention sharp and unrelenting. One of them shifted, turning toward me, and the void itself seemed to tremble. "You don't belong," it said, the words filling the air around me. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, the void cracked, a blinding light splitting through it like a jagged wound. And then I was back. The tundra stretched out around me once again, cold and endless under a sky that was somehow too bright. The thing on the horizon was gone, but its presence lingered heavy and unshakable. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. Behind me, in the distance, I saw something. A figure, standing perfectly still, watching. It didn't move. It didn't have to. I started walking, but no matter how far I went, I could feel it. Always there. Always watching. I don't know how long I've been out here. The sun never sets, the wind never changes, and the figure never moves.